Picture a staircase inside an old house, climbing steadily upward the way every staircase is supposed to. You follow it with your eyes, one flight, then a landing, then another flight, and then it simply stops, flush against a blank, unbroken ceiling. No door, no landing, no room waiting at the top, just wood and plaster climbing purposefully toward absolutely nothing. That exact staircase exists in a sprawling mansion in California, and it is only one of dozens of staircases in that single building that behave in ways no staircase should. Elsewhere in the world, in considerably older buildings, you can find staircases that hide something far stranger than a dead end. Rooms built directly into their own structure, invisible unless you already know to lift a particular step, or climb to a particular landing, or look for a trap door set into a spiral stairwell's roof. And in thousands of ordinary, unremarkable houses built across 3 centuries, you can find a second staircase entirely, plain, narrow, deliberately undecorated, tucked inside a wall a few feet from the grand one, built specifically so an entire category of person could move through the house without the family ever needing to see them do it. This is a film about staircases that don't behave the way staircases are supposed to, not because anyone wanted to create a maze or a mystery or a monument to confusion for its own sake. Though as you'll see, it can certainly look that way from the outside. Every single case in this film has a real name, a real date, and a real specific, well-documented reason behind it. And every one of those reasons turns out to be more interesting than nobody really knows. Here's the question worth spending the next hour on. Why does a staircase, the single, most ordinary, most walked past, least inspected feature of almost any multi-story building, keep turning up again and again across wildly different centuries and cultures as exactly the place where people choose to hide something? A fugitive king? A hunted priest? A discreet path for a nobleman avoiding his own court? An entire household staff kept invisible by design? And in one very famous and very badly misunderstood case, nothing more sinister than an earthquake nobody ever got around to fully repairing. Think, for a moment, about what a staircase actually is, functionally, in any building you've ever spent time in. It's pure connective tissue. It doesn't hold anything, doesn't display anything, doesn't have a use of its own beyond getting you from one floor to another as quickly and safely as possible. Nobody hangs a painting halfway up a staircase and calls it the point of the room. Nobody measures a staircase's exact dimensions out of curiosity the way they might admire a fireplace or a ceiling. A staircase earns almost no attention at all, precisely because it's doing its job perfectly when nobody thinks about it twice. That specific kind of invisibility, earned through pure, boring functionality, turns out to be exactly what makes a staircase such a reliable place to build something nobody's supposed to notice. Before getting into specific staircases, it's worth being precise about what this film is actually claiming, because there are 2 genuinely different things going on here. And mixing them up is exactly how a documented historical pattern turns into an unnecessary mystery. The first category is a staircase with something built directly into or behind its own physical structure. A step that lifts to reveal a cavity, a landing with a false back wall, a trap door set into the roof of a spiral stairwell. In these cases, the staircase itself is basically unchanged as a staircase. It still does its ordinary job of moving you between floors. It's simply carrying a secret passenger built into its own body that has nothing to do with getting you up or down. The second category is different and in some ways more interesting. A staircase that is itself a piece of a larger, invisible system. Not one staircase with a secret compartment, but 2 entire separate staircases serving the same building. One visible, decorated, and public, the other plain, narrow, and specifically designed to never be seen by the people using the first one. Nothing here is physically hidden in the sense of a secret cavity. The entire staircase exists in plain sight. What's hidden is its purpose and the people who use it. Both categories genuinely produce the effect this film's title describes, a hidden room connected to a grand staircase. But they get there by opposite methods. One conceals a space, the other conceals a use. Keeping this distinction in view is going to make every single example in the next 17 acts click into place a little more cleanly, because the specific historical pressures that produce a lifting stair tread are not remotely the same pressures that produce an entirely separate second staircase, even though both from a certain angle look like the same kind of secret. There's a third smaller pattern worth flagging early too, because one example in this film doesn't cleanly fit either category. A staircase that was never actually hiding anything on purpose at all, but simply stopped making sense after the specific event that shaped it was over, and nobody ever bothered to go back and fix it. That third pattern turns out to belong to the single most famous staircase in this entire film, which is exactly where the story is about to begin. Let's start with the single most famous, most photographed, most misunderstood staircase to nowhere anywhere in the world, the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. The scale of the place is genuinely difficult to hold in your head all at once. Sarah Winchester, widow of William Wirt Winchester, heir to the Winchester repeating arms fortune, purchased an 8-room farmhouse on the site in 1886 and then, essentially, never stopped building. Construction continued for roughly 38 years, by most accounts running in shifts around the clock, 7 days a week, stopping only on September the 5th, 1922, the day Sarah Winchester died in her sleep. What resulted, by the time construction finally halted, was a mansion of a reported 160 rooms, 40 separate staircases, 467 doorways, 10,000 individual window panes, 47 fireplaces, and at its tallest point before later damage, 7 full stories. It remains, by almost any measure, one of the strangest continuously inhabited private construction projects in American history. And scattered throughout that maze of rooms and stairwells are the details that made the house famous in the first place. Doors that open directly onto a blank wall with nowhere to go. A door on an upper floor that opens onto nothing at all but open air and a straight drop to the yard below. A so-called switchback staircase, 7 short flights, 44 steps in total, each riser only about 2 inches high, climbing barely 9 feet of actual height across a genuinely exhausting amount of walking. And, most famous of all, a staircase that climbs with complete architectural confidence directly into a flat, unbroken ceiling and simply ends there. Beyond the staircases and doors, the house accumulated a whole catalog of smaller oddities that fed directly into its reputation. A skylight set, flush into an interior floor, letting light pass down into the room below rather than in through a wall or roof. Windows shaped like spiderwebs, a chimney that reportedly rises through all 4 floors without ever quite connecting to a working fireplace. Popular tellings of the house's story have also long claimed an obsessive repetition of the number 13 throughout its design. 13 bathrooms, staircases built with exactly 13 steps, windows with 13 panes of glass, said to reflect some numerological ritual on Sarah Winchester's part. It's worth flagging early that this specific claim, like several others attached to the house, is considerably less solidly documented than the physical oddities themselves, and researchers examining the property's actual architectural records have found the number 13 appearing inconsistently at best. Worth remembering as this film returns in a few minutes to the question of exactly how much of this house's popular reputation the historical record actually supports. For decades, the explanation offered to visitors leaned hard into the supernatural, that Sarah Winchester, driven by grief and by guilt over the thousands of deaths caused by her family's rifles, was told by a Boston medium that she was cursed and that she could only appease the restless spirits of everyone ever killed by a Winchester gun by building continuously, forever, never completing a single finished plan. The confusion itself supposedly meant to disorient and trap the ghosts who followed her. It's a genuinely compelling story, and it's the version almost everyone has heard. The version repeated in tour guides, in ghost hunting television specials, in nearly every casual mention of the house you'll come across online. Before correcting it, it's worth being honest about exactly why it caught on so completely. It explains every single strange detail in the house with one single dramatic cause. A grieving, guilt-ridden widow, a medium's dire warning, an architecture of confusion built specifically to trap the dead. The story, as it's usually told, runs like this. Sarah Winchester's husband died of tuberculosis in 1881, following the earlier death of the couple's infant daughter years before. Grief-stricken and, according to the legend, seeking contact with her lost family, she consulted a Boston medium, sometimes named, sometimes left anonymous, depending on which version of the story you're hearing. The medium supposedly told her that the Winchester family fortune was soaked in the blood of everyone ever killed by a Winchester rifle, and that the spirits of those victims, along with her own husband and daughter, were haunting her specifically. Her survival, the medium warned, depended on moving west, buying a house, and building onto it continuously without ever finishing, because a completed house in this telling would finally let the spirits catch up with her. From there, every strange architectural choice in the house gets folded into the same explanation. The stairs to nowhere, built to confuse pursuing ghosts. The door opening onto open air, the same. The number 13, supposedly repeated obsessively throughout the house's design. 13 bathrooms, staircases with 13 steps, windows with 13 panes. Treated as further evidence of a woman engaged in an elaborate, decades-long occult ritual disguised as home renovation. It's a story built for exactly the kind of hour-long documentary this channel makes, which is precisely why it deserves the same treatment every other dramatic-sounding claim in this film is about to get. A careful look at what the actual historical record supports and what it doesn't. Here is where the story needs its first serious correction, and, much like the Irish Round Towers this channel has examined before, where the dramatic explanation turned out to be a real but secondary benefit rather than the primary cause. The corrected version turns out to be more interesting precisely because it's grounded in things you can actually verify. Historian Mary Jo Ignafo spent years researching Sarah Winchester's actual life for a detailed biography, and what she found, digging through contemporary records, correspondence, and household accounts, was strikingly different from the popular legend. She was unable to document a single seance, a single visit from a medium, or a single seance room anywhere in the house's recorded history. No contemporary source, nothing written during Sarah Winchester's actual lifetime mentions any of it. The earliest known appearance of the medium and curse story in print is a magazine article from 1928, 6 full years after Sarah Winchester had already died, meaning the story that now defines the house in public imagination was assembled, at the earliest, after there was no one left alive who could confirm or deny it. What the documented record actually supports is a considerably less supernatural, but arguably more human, explanation. Sarah Winchester was, by the evidence historians like Ignafo have assembled, an unusually wealthy, well-educated, technically curious widow who simply kept experimenting on her own house, year after year, without ever hiring a single architect to draw up one coherent master plan. She employed carpenters continuously, providing steady, well-paid work through economic downturns including the 1893 financial crisis. And she apparently just kept changing her mind, revising rooms, adding wings, tearing out and rebuilding sections as her own tastes and technical interests evolved. Continuous, unplanned, incrementally revised construction, sustained for nearly 4 decades, will naturally produce exactly the kind of structural non sequiturs this house is famous for. A staircase built to reach a floor that was later reshaped or removed is not evidence of a ritual against ghosts. It's what happens when nobody ever stops construction long enough to reconcile 38 years of accumulated individual decisions into a single coherent building. And the single most famous detail, the staircase that climbs directly into a blank ceiling, has an explanation that's almost disappointingly ordinary once you know it. On April the 18th, 1906, the devastating San Francisco earthquake struck the Bay Area, and it badly damaged the Winchester house, collapsing its top 3 floors along with an observation tower that had once crowned the structure. Rather than undertake the difficult, expensive work of fully rebuilding those unstable, damaged upper floors, Sarah Winchester simply had the remaining wreckage boarded up and abandoned in place. Staircases that had, until that morning, continued climbing straight into those now demolished upper floors were left exactly where the earthquake found them, genuinely leading nowhere, not because anyone designed them that way, but because the floor they used to reach simply isn't there anymore. It's an earthquake scar, preserved by neglect, mistaken for 100 years running as deliberate design. Move now from a staircase whose strangeness comes from an accident of history to staircases whose strangeness was the entire point from the very first plank laid down. English priest holes, built specifically into the physical structure of a staircase, during one of the most dangerous periods in English religious history. This channel has already covered in an earlier film the broader story of England's Catholic recusant families and the professional hide builders, most famously Nicholas Owen, who spent decades constructing concealed rooms inside their houses to hide fugitive priests from state search parties. What that earlier film didn't have room to cover in depth is just how often the staircase itself, specifically, became the actual hiding mechanism, not a fireplace, not an attic void, but the very stairs a search party would be climbing while hunting for exactly the person hidden inside them. Boscobel House in Shropshire is the clearest place to start, because its priest hole is tied to one of the best documented fugitive stories in all of English history. In September of 1651, King Charles II, freshly defeated at the Battle of Worcester and now a hunted man with a considerable price on his head, fled westward with a small circle of loyal companions. On the advice of the Earl of Derby, Charles specifically sought shelter with the Gifford family at Boscobel. Catholic recusants, chosen deliberately because a household that had spent decades hiding priests from the law would already have, in the Earl's words, the readiest means and safest contrivances to hide a king. It's worth understanding, briefly, what a staircase hide was actually built to defeat, because professional priest hunters in this period were not casually poking around. They worked methodically, sometimes over several days, measuring room dimensions against a house's external walls, tapping wood paneling and floorboards to listen for a hollow, poorly supported echo, and occasionally bringing in specialist tools to bore small holes into suspicious-looking cavities. A hide built into a staircase had to survive exactly this kind of patient professional scrutiny, which is precisely why, as the next two houses in this act demonstrate, the more sophisticated examples relied on genuine structural cleverness, rather than simply finding the deepest, darkest corner of the building and hoping nobody looked there. Boscobel had two priest holes. One sat beneath a closet off an upstairs bedroom. The other, the one connected to Charles's own escape, was reached by climbing the stairs toward the attic gallery, where a trapdoor at the very top opened down into a hide, only about 4 feet high. Charles II was, for his era, an unusually tall man, standing around 6 feet 2 inches. Spending a full night folded into a space barely a third his own height, directly above the very staircase soldiers might have been climbing at any moment, was by any account a genuinely miserable ordeal. But it worked. The search parties never found him, and Charles eventually escaped to exile in France, later returning in 1660 to reclaim the English throne. Harvington Hall in Worcestershire takes the staircase hide concept even further, with a level of deliberate misdirection that's worth walking through step by step, because it shows exactly how sophisticated this specific category of concealment could get in skilled hands. Built into and around Harvington's Great Staircase are 4 separate hiding places, all attributed on strong stylistic grounds to Nicholas Owen's work, and dated to around 1603. The most ingenious of the 4 sits directly beneath the staircase itself, and it was designed with a genuinely clever 2-layer trick, built specifically to defeat a determined, methodical search. Lift 2 of the wooden treads on the staircase, and you find a shallow cavity underneath, just large enough to plausibly hold a small stash of coins, plate, or other portable valuables. To a searcher who suspected something was hidden and started probing the stairs, finding this cavity would have felt like a genuine discovery. A real hidden compartment, holding real hidden valuables, exactly the kind of thing a search party expected to find in a recusant household. Many searchers, having found what looked like the secret, would reasonably stop looking any further. But that shallow cavity was itself the decoy. Concealed behind and beneath it sits the actual hide. A room roughly 5 feet 9 inches by 5 feet and 6 feet high, genuinely large enough for a grown man to remain hidden through an extended, thorough search, rather than a cramped void meant only for a few desperate hours. It's a hiding place built specifically to survive being partially discovered. Give the searcher a smaller, plausible secret to find so they never look for the larger one sitting directly behind it. This is a decoy strategy, not a size or depth strategy, and it's a mechanism this channel's earlier film on elevated architecture never had room to cover. Cotton Court in Warwickshire offers a third and genuinely distinct approach to hiding something inside a staircase. one built entirely around a single, elegant structural trick, making the hide reachable from only one direction. The hiding place at Cotton sits inside the tower of a gatehouse, at the very top of a spiral staircase. But critically, it cannot be reached from that staircase at all. The only way in is through a trapdoor cut into the turret roof, meaning a search party climbing the spiral stairs, no matter how carefully or thoroughly they searched every step and every landing on the way up, would find absolutely nothing because the actual hide sits entirely above the point their search would ever reach. You would need to already know to go up onto the roof itself, find the trapdoor, and climb down into the hide from above. The exact reverse of how anyone naturally searches a building. Inside are two separate hidden chambers, stacked directly on top of one another. The hide was rediscovered in 1858, and remarkably, it still contained its original rope ladder. The actual physical means by which a hidden priest would have climbed down from the roof access trapdoor into the chamber below, preserved for more than 2 centuries inside a space nobody had opened. Like Harvington's staircase hide, Cotton's is attributed to Nicholas Owen, and like Boscobel's, it's connected to genuine historical danger with real consequences. Priests sheltered at Cotton were directly caught up in the aftermath of the 1605 gunpowder plot, when the house's Catholic owners came under intense suspicion following the failed conspiracy to assassinate King James I. In more recent years, conservators at Cotton have gone back over the hide using tools Owen himself could never have imagined. Laser and 3-dimensional scanning equipment capable of mapping the hide's exact interior dimensions and structural relationship to the tower around it without requiring anyone to physically disturb 400-year-old masonry to do it. It's a modern, non-invasive version of the same basic principle this channel discussed measuring phantom rooms in an earlier film. Verify a hidden space's true shape and extent through careful, precise measurement rather than guesswork, just using 21st century scanning technology in place of a simple tape measure. 3 houses, 3 completely different staircase-based solutions to the exact same underlying problem. A trapdoor reached from beneath the treads at Harvington, a shallow decoy hiding a deeper room. An attic stair hide barely tall enough to sit in at Boscobel, a roof-only entrance unreachable from the stairs themselves at Cotton, and all 3, by most historians' assessment, built by the same single craftsman, adapting the same basic staircase concealment principle to whatever specific structure he happened to be working with. What's genuinely striking, looking at all 3 side by side, is that none of them repeat each other's specific mechanism. A less careful builder, having found one working method, might simply have reused it house after house. Owen instead treated every staircase as its own distinct engineering problem. The tread cavity worked at Harvington because that particular stairway happened to sit over open space large enough to hide a room beneath it. The roof trapdoor approach worked at Cotton because that particular staircase happened to sit inside a tower with roof access above it. The attic hide worked at Boscobel because that particular roofline happened to leave a genuinely low, cramped void that a smaller man could still exploit. Good concealment, in other words, was never a single reusable trick. It was a craftsman reading each specific building's own existing quirks and finding the one solution that specific structure was already quietly offering him. Across the English Channel, and the entire motive changes, even though the basic architectural instinct, a staircase serving a purpose its visitors were never meant to fully understand, stays remarkably consistent. French has a specific, still recognized architectural term for this, the escalier dérobé, which translates roughly as the stolen or concealed staircase, standing in deliberate contrast to a chateau's grand ceremonial escalier d'honneur. Its staircase of honor, built for public arrival and display. French sources studying these structures make an important distinction worth carrying through the rest of this act. An escalier dérobé is usually described as hidden but not secret. Unlike an English priest hole, which had to survive a genuinely hostile, methodical search by people actively hunting for it, a French concealed staircase mostly wasn't trying to escape detection by an enemy. It was built for discretion, not secrecy, a way for nobility to move through their own homes without being seen doing it, to reach a private council or a private apartment without the ceremony, the procession, and the public visibility that used the grand staircase demanded. At the Château de Blois, one of the French crown's great residences during the Wars of Religion, A narrow, concealed corridor and stair allowed King Henry III private, discreet access to his own council chamber, letting the king move through his own palace for matters of genuine political sensitivity without every courtier in the building watching him do it. And at Clos Lucé, the manor house near Amboise, where Leonardo da Vinci spent his final years under the patronage of King Francis I, local tradition holds that an underground passage once connected the house directly to the nearby Château d'Amboise, allowing the king to visit his aging Italian guests privately, without the full, formal spectacle a royal visit would otherwise require. Further south, the medieval fortress of Château de Loches offers a somewhat older, more defensively minded version of the same basic instinct. Rather than a single dramatic corridor, Loches is riddled with passages concealed within the sheer thickness of its own walls. Medieval masonry built thick enough, in an era before gunpowder artillery made such fortifications largely obsolete, to hide a functioning stairway inside the wall itself, connecting rooms without ever crossing an open, exposed space where an occupant could be observed or ambushed. Where Blois and Clos Lucé reflect the comparatively more relaxed court culture of the French Renaissance, Loches is a reminder that the concealed staircase tradition in France has genuinely medieval, defensively driven roots, considerably older than the specific stories of Henri III or Francis I. The underlying logic here is almost the exact opposite of a hunted priest's hide. An English recusant family building a priest hole was hiding a person from people actively trying to find him under threat of execution. A French king using a concealed staircase to reach his own council chamber wasn't hiding from anyone in any real danger sense. He was simply choosing, for reasons of privacy, efficiency, and the careful management of who saw him doing what, not to use the version of his own house that was built for being seen. That distinction matters more than it might first appear because it explains why so many escalier dérobé passages have survived only as fragments or vanished from their buildings altogether, in a way that English priest holes generally haven't. A priest hole had to be built with enough structural integrity to genuinely defeat a hostile professional search, which is exactly why so many of them still survive today, discovered intact centuries later. An escalier dérobé only ever needed to be discreet, not truly secret, and buildings get renovated, walls get reconfigured, and a passage that nobody was ever desperately trying to protect tends to simply get absorbed into whatever the next renovation required. The French tradition is, in a real sense, a victim of its own comparatively low stakes. Not every French solution to controlling who encounters whom on a staircase involved hiding anything at all, and the most famous counterexample sits at the Château de Chambord in the Loire Valley, in the form of one of the most celebrated staircases in the entire history of architecture, Chambord's double helix staircase. Rather than concealing a second path, Chambord's central staircase does something almost the opposite. It makes two completely separate paths simultaneously, fully visible, wound around a single shared central axis like two strands of the same rope. One spiral carries people climbing upward. The other, interleaved but structurally independent, carries people descending. And through openings cut into the central column, a person going up and a person going down can actually see each other, sometimes close enough to exchange a glance or a wave, without their two paths ever physically crossing or requiring either person to step aside for the other. It's worth sitting with exactly what problem this solves, because it's precisely the same underlying problem every hidden staircase in this film has been solving, just answered with the opposite tool. An escalier dérobé controls who sees whom by making one path invisible. Chambord's double helix controls who meets whom by making both paths fully visible but structurally, permanently separate. Total transparency used to engineer the exact same kind of controlled, non-overlapping circulation that a hidden corridor achieves through total concealment. Two opposite methods aimed at the same basic goal, letting one category of person move through a building without physically encountering another category of person, whether that's a courtier avoiding an inconvenient meeting or two branches of a royal household simply keeping out of each other's way. Tradition has long connected Chambord's design, including this staircase, to Leonardo da Vinci, who was living in France under royal patronage during the final years of his life, and is known to have discussed architectural ideas directly with King Francis I. It's worth being precise about how solid that connection actually is, because the timeline itself raises a genuine complication. Construction at Chambord formally began in 1519 under the documented supervision of the Italian architect Domenico da Cortona, and Leonardo died in May of that same year, 1519, meaning any personal involvement he had could only have come during the very earliest conceptual planning before a single stone of the actual staircase was laid. No surviving contract or signed drawing definitively proves Leonardo personally designed the staircase himself. Among architectural historians, the attribution remains a strong, plausible, and carefully studied tradition, not a documented, settled fact. Chambord itself took nearly 3 decades to complete, construction continuing from 1519 until 1547, the year Francis I himself died. In a detail that says something about how differently chateau building worked in this era compared to the endlessly personal, hands-on Winchester project covered earlier in this film, historians estimate that across those 28 years of construction, Francis I actually stayed at Chambord for a total of only around 72 days, commissioning a genuinely revolutionary building and then largely leaving its actual construction to run without him. The design itself, regardless of exactly who first sketched it, remains real, still standing, and still walkable today, which is more than can be said for several of the escalier dérobé passages mentioned in the previous act, most of which have long since been sealed, demolished, or simply lost to later renovation. Cross back to England one more time and the motive shifts again. From royal privacy to something considerably more mundane but arguably more consequential because it produced an architectural feature that ended up in nearly every wealthy household across an entire country for the better part of 3 centuries: the servants' back stairs. Credit for formalizing this specific innovation in English domestic architecture generally goes to Sir Roger Pratt, an architect working in the mid-17th century, most influentially at Coleshill House in Berkshire, built roughly between 1658 and 1662 for his cousin, Sir George Pratt. Coleshill introduced what architectural historians call the double-pile house plan, a design built around a central corridor giving separate, independent access to every room in the house, so that nobody ever needed to walk through one room to reach another. Paired with that corridor was Coleshill's other genuinely significant innovation: a dedicated back staircase reserved specifically for servants, entirely separate from the grand front staircase used by the family and their guests. For the first time in a formalized, widely imitated English house plan, the people who actually ran a wealthy household, cooking, cleaning, carrying coal, emptying chamber pots, managing every unglamorous physical task a large house required, could move between every floor without ever needing to use the same stairs, the same halls, or the same doors as the family they served. It's worth understanding what the double pile plan actually replaced, because the contrast is what made the servant staircase feel like such a genuine innovation at the time. Older English hall houses, common for centuries before Pratt's generation, were typically organized around a single central hall that essentially everyone in the household, family, guests, and servants alike, had to pass through to reach most other rooms. There was no meaningful way to separate circulation by household rank because the building's own layout physically required everyone to share the same core route through it. The double pile plan, with its independent corridor access to every room, solved that problem for the family and guests. The dedicated back staircase solved the same problem for the household staff, completing a building that could, for the first time, keep 2 entirely separate populations moving through it simultaneously, without either one needing to interact with the other's route at all. The back staircase itself rarely traveled alone. Houses wealthy enough to build a full, separate servant circulation system typically paired it with other purpose-built, invisible infrastructure serving the exact same goal. Dumbwaiters, small hand-operated lift shafts built directly into the house's structure specifically to move food and dishes between a basement kitchen and an upper-floor dining room without a single servant ever needing to physically carry a tray through a room the family was sitting in. Speaking tubes, simple hollow pipes built into the walls, let staff in a distant kitchen or basement communicate with the family's private rooms without anyone needing to walk the distance in person at all. None of these technologies hid a person or a fugitive the way a priest hole did. Together, they hid an entire category of physical, ongoing labor so completely that a family could spend an entire evening being fed, warmed, and attended to without ever directly witnessing a single one of the individual actions that made it happen. Coleshill House itself no longer survives. It burned in a fire in 1952 and was ultimately demolished in 1958, a detail worth sitting with for a moment, given how influential its plan turned out to be. The building that essentially launched an architectural convention followed in country houses across England for the next 2.5 centuries is, today, simply gone. Known now mostly through drawings, written descriptions, and the countless later houses that copied its basic logic. By the height of the Victorian era, the back staircase Roger Pratt had essentially formalized at Coleshill 2 centuries earlier had become close to universal in any household wealthy enough to employ live-in staff. Walk through a well-preserved Victorian country house today, and you'll typically find 2 entirely separate staircase systems running through the same building. A grand, decorated, often quite beautiful front staircase, positioned prominently for the family and their guests to see and be seen on, and a plain, narrow, deliberately undecorated back staircase, sometimes built directly into the thickness of a wall standing right beside the grand one, carrying an entirely different population up and down the exact same number of floors. The scale of the workforce this architecture was built to manage is worth stating plainly because it's easy to underestimate. England's 1871 census recorded roughly 1,494,000 people working as domestic servants across England and Wales. The overwhelming majority of them women, more than 1,300,000, against just under 160,000 men. Domestic service was, by a considerable margin, the single largest employment category for women in the entire country, a position it held right up until the disruption of the First World War. A back staircase wasn't a minor architectural footnote serving the occasional maid. It was the daily circulation route for what was, by raw numbers, one of the largest single occupational groups in Victorian Britain. The purpose here wasn't structural or defensive in any sense. Nobody was hiding from a search party or an assassin. It was explicitly, openly social. Keeping servants physically separated from the family's visible spaces maintained, for the family and their guests, the carefully cultivated illusion of a household that simply ran itself. Meals appearing, fires already lit, rooms already cleaned, with no visible evidence of the considerable human labor required to make any of it happen. Nobody carrying coal up from the cellar, nobody hauling dirty linens down to be washed, nobody emptying a chamber pot was ever supposed to cross paths with the people they served on the household's good stairs. Historians studying the below-stairs world of Victorian domestic service describe an entire network of backstairs and hidden internal passageways, allowing staff to move between kitchens, bedrooms, dining rooms, and parlors constantly, invisibly, reinforcing the household's class hierarchy through nothing more than which staircase you were and weren't allowed to use. This category of staircase concealment is worth pausing on specifically because it's different in kind from every other example covered so far in this film. A priest hole hides a fugitive person from people actively hunting for him. An escalier dérobé hides a private path from public view. Coleshill's back stairs, and every Victorian version of them that followed, hide neither an object nor an individual fugitive. They hide an entire category of ordinary, everyday human labor from the people who directly benefited from it. The thing being concealed is domestic work itself, performed by real people, structurally engineered out of sight of the family that employed them, for as long as the live-in servant economic model that required it remained standard practice. There's one more category of hidden staircase space this film needs to cover. And unlike everything examined so far, this one is going to require a genuinely different kind of care, because it's also the category where popular imagination and documented historical fact have drifted furthest apart: the Underground Railroad. The popular image, repeated in countless casual conversations, and honestly, in a fair number of less careful documentaries than this channel aims to be, involves a vast, coordinated secret network. Hidden tunnels running beneath entire towns, purpose-built concealed chambers in dozens of houses along established routes, secret signals passed from house to house, guiding escaping enslaved people safely north toward freedom. It's a genuinely inspiring image, and elements of it are absolutely real. The Underground Railroad existed, it did help thousands of enslaved people reach freedom, and real courageous people took real, serious legal risks sheltering fugitives. But historian Larry Guerra's foundational research into the subject, and considerable scholarship building on it since, found the specific claim about widespread secret tunnels and purpose-built hidden chambers to be substantially overstated relative to what the documented historical record actually supports. Most enslaved people escaping northward moved under cover of darkness on foot, not through elaborate tunnel networks, which would have been enormously expensive to dig, extremely difficult to keep genuinely secret from curious neighbors, and would have left obvious physical excavation evidence behind. Most fugitives who did receive indoor shelter along the way were, according to the documented record, simply given an ordinary upstairs bedroom, a basement, a barn, or a hiding spot in a cornfield, not a custom-built secret chamber designed and constructed specifically for concealment. Much of the more elaborate mythology, historians argue, took shape after the fact. In post-war reminiscence, once aging abolitionists and their descendants had genuine reasons, ranging from moral pride to simple storytelling instinct, to remember and retell their own family's involvement in the most dramatic terms available. One specific, particularly well-known example makes the pattern clear: the so-called secret quilt code, in which specific quilt patterns supposedly guided escaping enslaved people along safe routes. Despite how widely this story circulated in the 20th century, not a single formerly enslaved person interviewed during the extensive Works Progress Administration oral history project of the 1930s ever mentioned it. Historians who've traced the story's actual origin now regard it as a considerably later invention, likely dating from the closing years of the 20th century. A compelling piece of folklore, not a documented historical practice. Not every Underground Railroad staircase claim collapses under scrutiny, though, and the clearest counterexample is worth naming before moving to the film's central contrast. The John Rankin House on a hilltop above Ripley, Ohio, is one of the best documented Underground Railroad stations anywhere in the country, formally designated a National Historic Landmark in 1997. John Rankin, a Presbyterian minister and outspoken abolitionist, and his wife Jean sheltered an estimated 2,000 freedom seekers over the decades, sometimes as many as a dozen at once. And the house's staircase, in this case, isn't hidden at all. It's a full 100 steps, climbing the steep hillside from the Ohio riverbank straight up to the Rankin family's front door, still standing and still climbable by visitors today. This is precisely the kind of staircase this film has not been describing until now. Nothing about it is concealed, nothing about it hides a secret chamber. It's simply the actual, physical, well-documented path freedom seekers climbed on the last leg of reaching real, verified safety. Proof that the honest history here is often more striking than any invented secret room could be. Once you're looking at a claim the documentary record can actually stand behind. None of this is meant to dismiss the Underground Railroad, or the genuine courage it required, or the real, verifiable history behind it. Quite the opposite. It's meant to draw the sharpest possible line this film can draw between a family story, however sincerely believed, and however many generations it's been passed down through, and a claim that's actually been physically verified. And when genuine, physically documented evidence does surface, it stands out precisely because it can withstand exactly that kind of scrutiny. In 2019, conservators working at the Merchants House Museum in Manhattan, a well-preserved 19th century home built by Joseph Brewster, a documented, actively engaged abolitionist, made a genuine discovery during routine structural inspection. Inside a built-in closet on the home's second floor, they found a concealed space with a ladder leading down, physically integrated into the building's own structure, previously unknown even to the museum staff who had cared for the building for years. This wasn't a story passed down through a family for 6 generations with no physical trace to confirm it. It was a hidden space found through direct physical inspection of an actual building, connected to a specific, independently documented historical figure with a known, verifiable record of abolitionist activity. That's the entire point of placing this act directly after the last one. A story that's been told and retold for generations with no structural or documentary evidence behind it is not the same category of historical fact as a hidden space that's actually been found, measured, and dated by conservators working directly with the physical building. Both, in casual conversation, get called an Underground Railroad hiding place. Only one of them has actually earned that description through evidence anyone else can independently verify. this channel would be doing exactly the kind of uncritical, evidence-free storytelling it spent this entire film correcting in other people's claims if it didn't apply the same standard here, on a subject considerably more consequential than a Victorian mansion's odd staircase. It's worth being fair to the many families and small local museums across the country who sincerely believe and pass along in good faith a story about a hidden room in their own historic house. Most of these stories aren't deliberate fabrications. They're inherited beliefs, sometimes genuinely old, sometimes rooted in a real but now unprovable event, sometimes simply attached after the fact to an architectural oddity that actually has a more mundane explanation, the same way Sarah Winchester's staircase picked up a seance story it never actually had. The distinction this film is drawing isn't between honest people and dishonest ones. It's between a claim that's been tested against physical or documentary evidence and survived, and a claim that simply hasn't been tested yet. And treating those two categories as interchangeable is exactly how a real, important history gets quietly diluted by stories that merely sound like it. Step back now and lay all 5 categories covered in this film side by side. A California mansion's earthquake-scarred staircase to nowhere, 3 English priest holes built directly into staircase structures, a French tradition of discrete royal passages, an English and then broadly Victorian system of entirely separate servant staircases, and a body of underground railroad claims that requires genuinely careful sorting between documented fact and well-meaning legend. 5 completely different centuries, 5 completely different countries and cultures, 5 completely different reasons. An accident of geology and decades of unplanned construction, the threat of state execution for practicing an outlawed religion, the ordinary rhythms of court privacy and political intrigue, the maintenance of rigid class boundaries inside an ordinary household, and in some, but not all cases, the genuine, courageous concealment of human beings fleeing enslavement. None of these 5 explanations has anything structurally, culturally, or historically in common with any of the others. And yet every single one of them chose the staircase, specifically, as the site of concealment. Not the cellar, not the attic, not a false wall in some random interior room. The staircase, the one part of almost any multi-story building that everybody already expects to be there, that everybody walks past or up or down dozens of times a day without a second thought, and that almost nobody, under ordinary circumstances, ever stops to actually measure, question, or inspect. A staircase's entire job is to be so unremarkable, so purely functional, that nobody looks twice at it. That exact quality, total, boring, structural inevitability, turns out to be precisely what makes it such a reliably useful place to hide something, whatever that something happens to be, in wildly different centuries, for wildly different reasons, by people who never had any contact with one another and never needed any. If staircases have served as hiding places in one form or another, across at least 4 centuries and 2 continents, why doesn't anyone build them this way anymore? The honest answer, once again, is that this pattern doesn't have one single cause. It has 5 separate ones, each of which faded for its own specific, mostly unrelated historical reason. The English priest holes stopped being necessary for the same reason this channel has covered before. The specific state-sanctioned persecution of English Catholics eased gradually across the generations following Nicholas Owen's death, culminating in full Catholic emancipation in the 19th century. Once sheltering a priest was no longer a capital offense, the entire desperate logic behind concealing one inside your own staircase simply stopped applying. The French escalier dérobé faded along with the specific court culture that made it useful, as royal and noble life gradually moved away from the elaborate rituals of visibility and access that defined the era of Blois and Chambord. The practical need for a private, discreet, parallel path through your own palace declined along with it. Modern privacy doesn't require a hidden staircase when an ordinary closed door in a considerably less rigidly ceremonial society accomplishes roughly the same thing. The French Revolution and the broader collapse of absolute monarchy and its rigid court hierarchies across Europe in the century that followed did more than end specific reigns. It ended the entire social framework of formal visibility and controlled access that had made a discreet private staircase feel genuinely necessary to the people who once used them. The Victorian backstairs declined for perhaps the most straightforward reason of all. The live-in domestic service economy that required them largely collapsed across the 20th century, accelerated by 2 world wars that pulled workers into factories and military service, and by the simple long-term economic shift away from large households employing dozens of full-time indoor staff. When a house no longer employs a live-in staff of 10 or 20 people, it no longer needs an entire second staircase system built specifically to keep them physically separate from the family. The Underground Railroad, and whatever mixture of documented shelter and later legend surrounded it, ended for the most consequential reason in this entire film. Slavery itself ended in the United States, formally with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865 following the Civil War. There was, after that point, no fugitive population left needing to be hidden from slave catchers at all. And the Winchester house's particular strangeness never really ended in the sense the other 4 categories did. It simply stopped all at once the moment Sarah Winchester herself died in 1922, and the continuous, unplanned decades of construction that produced it came to an abrupt halt. There was no gradual social shift to point to. There was just one woman and one uninterrupted 38-year building project, and the day both finally stopped. There's a genuinely useful pattern hiding inside these 5 separate endings worth naming directly before moving on. 4 of the 5 categories in this film ended because the specific danger, hierarchy, or social convention that required concealment in the first place gradually stopped existing. Persecution eased, court ritual relaxed, an economic model collapsed, an entire legal institution was abolished. Only the Winchester house ended for a reason that had nothing to do with changing social conditions at all. It simply ran out of the one person driving it. That's a meaningful distinction. Most of the concealment architecture in this film was a response to something happening in the wider world. The Winchester house was a response to nothing but one individual's own decades of restless, unsupervised curiosity, which is exactly why it stands apart from every other example covered here, and exactly why its explanation, however mundane, still feels so singular. As with every film this channel has made about real, well-documented architecture that turns out to be stranger and more interesting than most people ever notice, this specific pattern, staircases across unconnected centuries and cultures, repeatedly built to hide something, has in recent years been pulled into a considerably more speculative conversation online, and it deserves to be addressed directly rather than quietly ignored. The broadest version of the online Tartaria theory, applied to a pattern like the one covered in this film, suggests that recurring, unexplained architectural strangeness, staircases that lead nowhere, structures with concealed internal space, elaborate hidden passages nobody today would think to build, might represent something more than independent, locally explicable human ingenuity. In this reading, the repetition itself becomes the evidence. If unconnected cultures across centuries kept arriving at the same basic idea of hiding something inside a staircase, doesn't that suggest some deeper, shared, possibly suppressed common origin rather than pure coincidence? We want to be exactly as direct here as this channel has been in every other film covering this kind of theory. We are not telling you it's definitively true, and we are not telling you it's definitively false. What we can tell you, because we've just spent the better part of an hour proving it with real dates, real named houses, real historians' research, and in the case of the Underground Railroad, a real and important distinction between documented fact and well-intentioned legend is that the underlying pattern is completely real and does not require inventing a lost, suppressed civilization to explain it. A widow's decades of unplanned building, frozen mid-earthquake, a hunted priest, and a craftsman skilled enough to build him 3 genuinely different kinds of staircase hide, a king's discreet path to his own council chamber, a household's rigid, staircase-enforced class boundary, a fugitive population, some of whose shelter is well documented and some of whose legend has outrun the evidence. 5 separate, independently verifiable explanations, not one hidden thread connecting them, just the same practical human instinct, rediscovered over and over that an unremarkable staircase is an unusually good place to hide whatever most needs hiding. There's also a specific problem the broadest version of this theory runs into once you actually line up this film's timeline, the same way an earlier film on this channel found when it checked the dates on elevated entrances. Cotton Court's priest hole dates to the 1590s or early 1600s. Chambord's staircase was built starting in 1519. Coleshill's backstairs date from the 1650s. The Winchester house was built between 1886 and 1922. These 4 dates alone span more than 3 centuries on 2 different continents, tied to 4 completely unrelated causes: religious persecution, royal court privacy, English domestic service economics, and one widow's personal, unsupervised building habit. A genuinely unified lost civilization, suppressed and later rediscovered piecemeal, would need to explain why its supposed shared knowledge kept vanishing and reappearing among people who left behind detailed written records of solving each problem completely from scratch, entirely on their own terms, every single time. Independent, convergent problem-solving doesn't need that explanation at all. It only needs enough builders over enough centuries, running into similar problems with the same basic tool always sitting right there in front of them. So what do you do with a story like this one? A mansion with a staircase built toward a floor that no longer exists. 3 completely different staircases in 3 English houses, each hiding a different fugitive priest in a different way. A French king's private route to his own council table. An entire household staff moving invisibly through walls a few feet from the family they served. And a chapter of American history where the honest, careful answer is sometimes simply, we can't fully verify that particular claim. You do the same thing this channel keeps asking you to do, film after film. Look a little more carefully at the parts of a building nobody usually bothers to look at twice, and ask what real, specific, documentable reason might explain something that looks, at first glance, strange enough to invent a mystery around. Because here's the through line connecting every staircase in this hour, and it's worth sitting with directly. An ordinary flight of stairs turns out to be one of the most quietly useful pieces of architecture a builder has ever had access to, precisely because everyone takes it completely for granted. Nobody measures a staircase. Nobody questions why it's shaped the way it is. Nobody stops to wonder what might be built into the wall 6 inches from the 3rd step. A grieving widow, a hunted priest, a discreet king, an invisible household staff, and, carefully, honestly separated from the legends that have grown up around them, real fugitives fleeing real enslavement, all independently arrived at the exact same quiet insight. If you need somewhere to hide a person, a path, or an entire category of human labor, don't build something new and conspicuous. Just look at the staircase everyone already walks past a dozen times a day and use it. The staircase to nowhere in San Jose isn't a monument to grief-driven madness, and it isn't evidence of a lost civilization either. It's an earthquake, boarded up and left exactly where it happened, in a house nobody ever finished building. That is not legend. That is not internet speculation. That is simply what happens when history keeps happening to an ordinary staircase, 1 decade at a time. And it turns out to be a far better story every single time than the one that skips the research and reaches straight for the mystery. The next time you climb an ordinary staircase, in your own home, in a museum, in some old building you're touring on vacation, it's worth remembering, just for a moment, everything this hour has actually shown you can be sitting quietly inside one, a shallow decoy cavity built to satisfy a searcher before the real hiding place beneath it. A trapdoor reachable only from a roof nobody thinks to check. A second, entirely separate staircase built into the wall 6 feet away, carrying a workforce a family never had to see. 100 stone steps climbing a riverbank hillside, still standing exactly where thousands of footsteps once made them matter. None of it required magic, and none of it required a lost civilization. It required, in every single case, a builder who understood something simple and enduring about human attention. That the surest way to hide something is to put it inside the one thing everybody already assumes has nothing to hide.